And did a stranger's smile force your quiet life into a moral abyss? A quiet life id carefully constructed, piece by painstaking piece, here in the shadowed valley was a fragile thing. I knew it, but I hadn't known how utterly and completely it could shatter, not until I stood there, clutching my brother's hand, the scent of antiseptic stinging my nostrils, forced to choose between the only family I had left and the unsettling truth that had just walked into our lives, charismatic smile and all. Felt like standing on a precipice, staring down into the dizzying void of a moral dilemma, knowing that whatever I decided, someone would get hurt. And I, Sharon Ivanov, 37F, the reigning queen of conflict avoidance, was suddenly the one holding the hammer. Our mountain village, nestled deep within the crags, had always felt like a sanctuary. A place where the air tasted clean, the pace was slow, and everyone knew everyone's business, for better or worse. Mostly for worse, when your business involved a family legacy that felt more like a lead weight than a proud tradition. Our family, the Ivanovs, had been the unofficial chroniclers of the village's history for generations, maintaining the old records, the census data, the surprisingly detailed genealogical charts. It was a dusty, often thankless job, but it was our asterisk job. Philip, 41M, my older brother, saw it as a sacred duty, a calling, the pinnacle of his overachieving existence. Me? I saw it as a cozy, quiet corner where I could hide from the broader world and its many sharp edges. Philip and I shared the old family home, a rambling stone house that always felt a little too big, a little too quiet, especially since our parents passed. He occupied the vast, sun-drenched study, surrounded by ancient ledgers and maps, a self-appointed village archivist and local historian. I, on the other hand, gravitated towards the kitchen, the garden, anywhere that didn't smell of old paper and the weight of ancestral expectations. My days were a gentle rhythm, morning coffee on the porch, tending to my small herb garden, a few hours assisting Philip with the endless, meticulous work of updating village records, mostly by digitizing his handwritten notes, a task he tolerated more than embraced, then perhaps a walk along the river. It was a life designed for minimal friction, precisely how I liked it. Then Jeremy Hayes, 43M, blew into town like a gust of wind from the city. He arrived in a sleek, suspiciously new SUV, a stark contrast to the rusty pickups and battered sedans that dotted our village roads. He bought the old Miller place, a sprawling property on the outskirts that had been empty for years, supposedly with plans to turn it into a high-end wellness retreat. The village buzzed with curiosity, suspicion, and a healthy dose of excitement. Most newcomers, particularly those from the city, tended to be a flash in the pan, a temporary disruption before they realized the Wi-Fi was spotty and the nearest decent espresso was an hour's drive away. But Jeremy seemed different. He was effortlessly charming, with a smile that reached his eyes and a laugh that echoed genuine amusement. He was friendly to everyone, remembered names on the first meeting, and quickly became a fixture at the one general store and the tiny, perpetually half-empty pub. He even volunteered to help organize the annual Summer Solstice Festival, an event usually run by a committee of well-meaning but utterly exhausted villagers. People, even the most cynical among us, started to like him. Philip, however, was immediately wary. "He's too polished, Sharon," Philip had declared one evening, peering over his spectacles at me as I chopped vegetables for dinner. "Too eager. No one comes to a place like this wanting to help unless they're after something." I just shrugged. "Maybe he's just nice, Philip. Some people are," Philip snorted. "You always see the best in people, Sharon. It's a charming quality, but in this case, dangerously naive. He's a newcomer. We know nothing about his background. He bought the Miller place sight unseen, paid cash, didn't even haggle. Who does that? Someone who has a lot of money and wants a quiet life?" I offered, knowing it wouldn't convince him. He just shook his head, already dismissing my point. Philip was like that. Once he'd formed an opinion, especially about something that threatened the perceived order of our village, it was set in stone. He saw himself as the protector of our little world, the guardian of its traditions, and Jeremy was an unknown variable, a potential disruption. My first real interaction with Jeremy outside of a polite nod at the store was during one of my walks. I was following a lesser-used trail that wound up to a small, secluded waterfall, a spot I considered my personal sanctuary. Heard voices, then laughter, and rounded a bend to see Jeremy sitting on a smooth rock by the water, sketching in a large, leather-bound notebook. He looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "Didn't expect to see anyone up here. This place is magical." I felt a faint blush creep up my neck. "It is," I agreed, a little awkwardly. "I come here often." He nodded, making space on the rock next to him. "Jeremy, by the way. I suppose you already know that. Everyone here seems to know everyone else's life story before they've even unpacked their bags." He chuckled, and I found myself smiling back. "Sharon," I replied, sitting down carefully. "And yes, news travels fast in these parts." We talked for a while. He wasn't pushy, didn't ask personal questions. He talked about his travels, his love for nature, his rather vague plans for the wellness retreat. He seemed genuinely interested when I spoke about the unique ecosystem of the valley, the rare plants that grew here, the migratory birds. He even showed me some of his sketches, landscapes rendered with surprising skill. There was a raw, almost untamed beauty to them, a stark contrast to his polished demeanor. It made him feel more real, less like the character Philip had painted. I left feeling a lightness I hadn't realized I was missing, a pleasant hum in my chest. For the next few weeks, I found myself bumping into Jeremy more and more often. He'd be at the general store, offering to help Mrs. Henderson unload a delivery, or he'd be walking his surprisingly well-behaved golden retriever, Buster, along the river path, always with a friendly wave and an easy conversation. He started showing up at the archives, too, ostensibly to research the history of the Miller property, but often lingering, asking Philip about the old families, the village lore. Philip remained cordial but distant, his skepticism a palpable barrier. He'd answer Jeremy's questions with precise, almost clinical detail, then retreat behind his ledgers, leaving me to make polite small talk. I noticed Jeremy observing Philip sometimes, a thoughtful, almost studying look on his face. It wasn't hostile, just curious. He always made an effort to include me in the conversation, asking for my input, listening intently to my quiet contributions, which Philip rarely did. I found myself looking forward to his visits, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was a new, interesting dynamic, a fresh breeze in the stagnant air of our routine. Then came the day the air went out of my lungs. It started subtly. A persistent cough Philip developed after a particularly cold and damp spring. Dismissed it as a touch of the flu, then just allergies. Philip was never sick. He was robust, meticulous, almost machine-like in his dedication to his work. He'd brag about his perfect attendance record throughout school, his never missed a day of work streak. His health was a source of pride, another metric by which he measured his superiority. So when he started looking pale, losing his appetite, and the cough worsened into a hacking, breathless wheeze, I grew genuinely worried. "Philip, you need to see Dr. Evans," I urged one morning, watching him push his breakfast around his plate, his usually sharp eyes dull. "Nonsense, Sharon. It's nothing a good night's rest won't fix. Just a stubborn cold," he rasped, struggling to take a deep breath. He even looked a bit thinner around the face. It was alarming. But Philip, being Philip, refused. He had a natural distrust of anything outside his own carefully constructed systems, and doctors were high on that list. Preferred to self-diagnose from his ancient medical texts, concocting herbal remedies that smelled vaguely of damp earth and regret. I knew arguing with him was like trying to reason with a rock slide. He'd just dig in his heels further. My anxiety escalated with each passing day. He started spending more time lying down, exhausted, even in the middle of the day. The archive, usually a beacon of his diligent presence, was often dark. One afternoon I found him slumped over his desk, a half-written note clutched in his hand, his breathing shallow and rattling. My heart leaped into my throat. This wasn't a cold, this was something serious. "Philip," I rushed to him, shaking his shoulder gently. His skin was clammy. "Philip, wake up, you need a doctor now," he stirred, groaning. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "No, Sharon, just tired." That was it. I couldn't argue anymore. I had to act. I raced to the phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Dr. Evans' office, the only clinic in our small village. Dr. Evans, a kind, elderly woman who knew everyone since birth, listened patiently to my frantic description of Philip's symptoms. She told me to bring him in immediately, or she'd come to the house. I opted for the former, knowing Philip would put up less resistance if he felt he had some semblance of control. Getting him into the car was a monumental effort. He was weak, disoriented, and still muttering protests. I practically had to half-carry his considerable frame down the porch steps. As I struggled, a familiar SUV pulled up to our driveway. It was Jeremy. He had a small potted plant in his hand, a gift for Philip, he said, for his garden. He took one look at Philip, slumped against me, gasping for breath, and his charismatic smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp concern. "Sharon, what's happened?" he asked, rushing over without hesitation. "He looks terrible." "He's sick," I managed, my voice strained with effort and fear. "I'm taking him to Dr. Evans. He wouldn't go before." Without a word, Jeremy gently but firmly took Philip's other arm, supporting his weight. "Let me help. You can't manage him alone." Together, we maneuvered Philip into the passenger seat of my old sedan. Philip was too weak to resist, just slumped against the headrest, eyes closed, his breathing a horrifying symphony of gasps and wheezes. The drive to the clinic, usually a 10-minute amble, felt like an eternity. Jeremy followed closely behind in his SUV. At the clinic, Dr. Evans took one look and her face tightened. She ushered Philip straight into an examination room, her usual calm replaced by an urgent efficiency. Jeremy waited with me in the small, sterile waiting room. I paced, wringing my hands, the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. He sat quietly, observing me, occasionally offering a comforting word. "He's strong, Sharon," Jeremy said, his voice low. "He'll pull through." I could only nod, tears pricking at my eyes. I hadn't realized how utterly terrified I was until that moment. Philip and I, despite our differences, were all we had left. The thought of losing him was a cold, sharp knife to my chest. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, Dr. Evans emerged, her face grave. "Sharon," she began, her voice soft but firm. "It's serious. His lungs are severely compromised. Pneumonia certainly, but something else too. I've done a preliminary scan with the old X-ray machine, and it's concerning. I've called for an ambulance. He needs to go to the regional hospital immediately. They have the equipment, the specialists." My world tilted. Regional hospital was a 2-hour drive away, a place I rarely visited, a symbol of the larger, more frightening world I tried to avoid. "The regional hospital?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean, something else?" Dr. Evans sighed, rubbing her temples. "There's a shadow, a mass. It could be a severe infection, an abscess, or it could be something much worse. We need definitive scans, a biopsy." "A mass?" I choked out, my blood turning to ice. "Like a tumor." He didn't answer directly, just gave me a look of deep compassion. "We need to know, Sharon, and we need to know fast. He's very weak." The ambulance arrived, its siren a mournful wail that echoed through our quiet village. Jeremy stood beside me as they carefully loaded Philip onto the stretcher. Philip was barely conscious, a pale, frail shadow of his former self. He didn't even protest. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated dread. "Drive you," Jeremy said, his hand warm and steady on my arm. "You shouldn't be alone." I nodded, grateful, too numb to object. The drive to the regional hospital was a blur of highway, trees, and my own racing thoughts. Jeremy didn't press for conversation, just offered me a bottle of water and let me stare out the window, lost in my fear. He turned on the radio quietly, a classical station, its gentle melodies a strange counterpoint to the storm raging inside me. At the hospital, it was a whirlwind of emergency room doctors, nurses, forms to fill out, questions to answer. I felt utterly out of my depth, overwhelmed by the sterile fluorescent lights and the hurried professional language. Jeremy stayed by my side, a silent, comforting presence. He even went to get me coffee, his quiet competence a stark contrast to my unraveling. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, a doctor finally came out. He was young, tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "Mr. Garcia's sister?" he asked. "Yes," I croaked, pushing myself to my feet. Jeremy rose with me. "We've run some preliminary tests," the doctor said, his voice flat. "The pneumonia is severe. We've started him on aggressive antibiotics. But the scan, there's a large, irregular mass in his right lung. It's highly suspicious for malignancy. We need to perform a bronchoscopy and biopsy as soon as possible to confirm." "Malignancy," I repeated, the word hanging in the air, heavy and dark. "Cancer." Philip, my pragmatic, rock-solid brother. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. He was so careful, so dedicated to his routines, so focused on order. And now this. I spent the next 2 days practically living at the hospital, perched on a hard plastic chair beside Philip's bed. He was still weak, drifting in and out of consciousness. And he was lucid, his eyes would find mine, full of a fear I'd never seen in him before. He couldn't speak much, his breathing still labored, but his grip on my hand was surprisingly strong. Jeremy visited every day, bringing food, fresh clothes, books, anything to make the ordeal slightly more bearable. He'd sit in the chair opposite me, sometimes just reading, sometimes making quiet observations about the hospital, sometimes coaxing me to eat. His presence was a lifeline. Even managed to make Philip smile once or twice with a dry, self-deprecating joke. The biopsy results came back on the 3rd day. The news was devastating. Stage IV lung cancer. It had spread to his lymph nodes, possibly elsewhere. The doctors were grim. The prognosis was poor. They talked about palliative care, about managing symptoms, about quality of life. My world crumbled. Philip, my brother, my constant, was dying. I sat there, numb, listening to the medical jargon wash over me, trying to grasp the enormity of it. Jeremy, who had been sitting patiently, rose and put a hand on my shoulder. "Sharon, I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice laced with genuine sadness. Philip, who had been lying still, eyes closed, suddenly stirred. He opened his eyes, fixed them on Jeremy, and a flicker of something, clarity, perhaps desperation, entered them. Gestured weakly, trying to speak, but only a raspy whisper emerged. "What is it, Philip?" I leaned closer, my heart breaking. He struggled, then pointed a trembling finger at Jeremy. "He knows," my head snapped up. "Knows what, Philip?" Jeremy's face was unreadable. He looked from Philip to me, then back to Philip, a flicker of something unidentifiable in his eyes. He quickly masked it, but I'd seen it. Philip took a shallow, painful breath. "The Miller property, the well, Jeremy knows?" His voice faded and he closed his eyes, drifting back into sleep. I stared at Jeremy, my mind reeling. The Miller property, the old well. What did Philip mean? And why did he say Jeremy knows? My brother in his delirium was throwing out cryptic clues. Clues that somehow implicated the man who had been my rock for the past few days. The man I was starting to trust. Jeremy met my gaze, his charismatic smile now replaced by a serious, almost strained expression. Hesitated, then spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Sharon, there's something I need to tell you. Something about the Miller property and why I bought it. It's not just about a wellness retreat." He paused, taking a deep breath. "It's about the water, the well on that property. And it's complicated, very complicated." My conflict-avoidant nature screamed at me to just walk away, to ignore the implication, to pretend I hadn't heard Philip's words or Jeremy's confession. But the image of Philip, frail and dying, haunted my mind. And the village, our home. Philip's cryptic words, "he knows," echoed in my ears. Was there a connection between the well and Philip's illness? Was Jeremy involved? And what did he know? A cold dread began to mingle with my grief. The sanctuary I'd built, the quiet life it embraced, was under threat. Suddenly, my biggest problem wasn't just my brother's devastating diagnosis, but a secret that connected the charismatic newcomer to our family's tragedy. A secret that demanded to be unearthed, no matter how uncomfortable the truth. I looked at Jeremy, at the man who had been a comfort, a lifeline, and wondered what depths of complexity lay beneath his charming facade. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my life and the life of our village was about to become anything but quiet. I looked at Jeremy, at the man who had been a comfort, a lifeline, and wondered what depths of complexity lay beneath his charming facade. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my life and the life of our village was about to become anything but quiet. My eyes, red-rimmed and burning, finally found Jeremy's. "Complicated?" I echoed, the word a raw rasp in my throat. "My brother's dying, Jeremy. What could possibly be more complicated than that? What do you know about the well? About the Miller property? What are you hiding?" My voice rose with each question, a furious tremor I barely recognized. The conflict-avoidant Sharon, the one who shrank from confrontation, was being pushed to the brink. Jeremy flinched, not from anger, but from something akin to pain. He didn't offer a platitude or a comforting touch. Instead, he took a step back, his gaze flickering towards Philip's door, then back to me. "Not here, Sharon. Not now. We need to talk, but not here." Voice was low, urgent, laced with a seriousness that cut through my initial fury. "Please, trust me on this. Let's go somewhere we can speak freely." The hospital waiting room suddenly felt like a fishbowl, every passing nurse, every quiet murmur from another family, an intrusion. Despite the gnawing suspicion, the desperate need for answers warred with a deep-seated exhaustion. And there was still that fragile thread of trust, woven by his unwavering support over the past few days. I nodded numbly. "Where?" "My place," he said immediately. "The Miller property. It's the best place to explain everything. It's part of the story." Leaving Philip felt like tearing a piece of myself away, but the doctors had said he was stable for now, heavily sedated. The promise of answers, however terrifying, pulled me forward. The drive back to the village was silent, save for the hum of Jeremy's SUV. My mind raced, trying to connect the scattered pieces. Philip's illness, the Miller property, the well, Jeremy's evasiveness, his sudden appearance in our lives. What dark secret could bind them all? When we arrived at the Miller place, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The house, even newly purchased, still held an air of neglect, though Jeremy had clearly begun some work on it. It led me around to the back, past skeletal rose bushes and what looked like the remnants of an old vegetable patch. Tucked away near a gnarled apple tree, partially hidden by tall weeds, was an old stone well, its wooden cover warped and crumbling. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. "This is it," Jeremy said, gesturing towards the well. His usual charm was entirely absent, replaced by a somber gravity. He pulled a small, worn notebook from his back pocket, not the sketch one he'd seen before, but something heavier, filled with intricate notes and diagrams. The Miller family, they owned this property for generations. They were good people, but they faced a lot of hardship. Their land was cursed, some said, with a blight that kept their crops from flourishing, their livestock from thriving. They never could figure out why. He paused, his gaze fixed on the well. My family knew why. My heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath. My great-grandmother, a woman named Alina Hayes, grew up in this valley. She was a healer, a wise woman, but she was also a chemist, self-taught, with an unusual understanding of the earth. She left the valley years ago after a tragedy, but she kept meticulous records. Records I inherited. He opened the notebook, flipping to a page filled with dense handwriting and faded diagrams. She was convinced that the Miller family's troubles and a series of unexplained illnesses in the village, particularly among families living downstream from this property, were linked to something in the water. Something unnatural. Unnatural? I whispered, a cold dread seeping into my bones. What does that mean? This well, Jeremy explained, kneeling down and brushing away some of the moss from the stone lip, is situated on a unique geological formation. There's a particular mineral deposit deep underground, naturally occurring but highly toxic, a rare form of arsenic. My great-grandmother suspected that the old mining operations, long abandoned, higher up the mountain, had disturbed the natural strata, causing runoff that leached into the water table, concentrating here, right beneath the Miller well. It's not in the main river, not directly, but in an underground tributary that feeds this well, and then slowly, subtly, contaminates the local groundwater, especially after heavy rains. My mind reeled. Arsenic? Are you saying Philip's sick because of arsenic? The words felt absurd, yet a terrifying logic began to form. Philip, the archivist who would have drunk the village water, prepared his herbal concoctions with it, perhaps even spent years unknowingly exposing himself to it through the very air in the old, damp house, which relied on the local spring for its water. A spring that could easily be contaminated by the same groundwater. Philip's lungs, his pride in his natural remedies that perhaps amplified the exposure, his resistance to modern medicine. It all clicked into a horrifying, tragic picture. Can't say for certain, Sharon, Jeremy said, his voice gentle. I'm not a doctor, but chronic exposure to arsenic, even in low doses, can lead to severe respiratory problems, lung damage, and yes, various cancers. My great-grandmother documented cases in this valley that match Philip's symptoms decades ago before people knew what to look for. She was dismissed as a superstitious old woman, her warnings ignored. She eventually left disheartened, but she never stopped her research. Even tried to buy this property to seal the well, but the Millers refused to sell. So you bought it too? What? Seal the well? I asked, my voice thin. He nodded. Yes, that, and to use the rest of the land to create a wellness retreat that would actually promote genuine health using purified water and act as a cover for my real work. I'm a hydrologist, Sharon, specializing in remediation. My great-grandmother's notes were my inheritance, and her unfinished work became my mission. I've been sampling the water for months, quietly, confirming her findings. The levels fluctuate, but they're there. And yes, they're dangerous, especially for long-term residents. The pieces, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, now formed a horrifying mosaic. Philip's cryptic words, he knows, the Miller property, the well. Not delirium, but a desperate attempt to reveal the truth, a truth he must have stumbled upon in the dusty archives, perhaps connecting the old family's illnesses to the Miller property, but without the scientific understanding to fully grasp it. My brother, the guardian of the village's history, had discovered its most dangerous secret. And Jeremy, the charismatic newcomer, was not a threat, but a potential savior, a man driven by a legacy of his own. Why didn't you say anything? I whispered, a fresh wave of despair washing over me. Why did you keep the secret? Jeremy stood up, his face etched with regret. Because it's not simple, Sharon. Imagine the panic, the lawsuits, the damage to the village's economy. The Miller family descendants who still live here would be devastated. Proving it, securing the necessary permits, getting the village council to act. It's a monumental undertaking. I needed to gather more evidence, to understand the full scope of the contamination, to have a concrete plan for remediation before I dropped a bombshell like this. I wanted to come in as a solution, not just a messenger of doom. Philip was suspicious, and rightly so from his perspective. If I'd tried to explain this to him right away, he would have dismissed me as a charlatan, or worse, someone trying to undermine the village's heritage. He was right. Philip, with his rigid adherence to tradition and distrust of outsiders, would have shut him down immediately. I knew Philip better than anyone. This wasn't just about a scientific truth. It was about the very identity of the village, its history, its perceived purity. So, what now? I asked, the numbness in my chest giving way to a strange, almost terrifying clarity. My conflict-avoidant nature was still there, but it was now dwarfed by a fierce, protective instinct for my brother and for our village. We tell the right people, Jeremy said, his gaze firm. We present the evidence. We fight for this, for Philip, for everyone who's lived here. He looked at me, his eyes earnest. I can't do it alone. I need your help, Sharon. You know this village. You know its people. You're an Ivanov. That means something here. We need to work together. Unexpected alliance. The words hung in the air. Philip, my dying brother, had unknowingly set the stage for it. This wasn't just about Philip's life or Jeremy's mission. It was about the heart of our village, its future. And for the first time, I felt a strength, a purpose that had nothing to do with hiding. 2 weeks later, the sterile hospital room had become a second home. Philip's condition remained critical but stable. He was more lucid now, though still terribly weak. Aggressive chemotherapy had begun, a brutal assault on his already fragile body. The doctors offered little hope, but Philip remarkably had found a quiet dignity in his suffering. He listened, truly listened, as Jeremy and I explained everything about the well, the arsenic, the Miller family history, and Jeremy's great-grandmother's research. Philip, the man who clung to facts and figures, processed it all with a newfound vulnerability. There was no anger, no accusations, just a quiet, profound sadness. I saw the connections, he rasped, his voice barely audible, holding my hand. The old records, the patterns of illness, I didn't know what it meant. A tear traced a path down his gaunt cheek. All this time, protecting the village, and I was part of the problem. No, Philip, I countered, squeezing his hand. You were doing your job, you just didn't have all the pieces. No one did. Except Jeremy's great-grandmother. Jeremy, seated quietly nearby, nodded. Your brother's records were invaluable, Sharon. They corroborated my great-grandmother's findings almost perfectly. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to build such a strong case. He was always protecting the village, Philip was, even now. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Philip's lips. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen on him in weeks. My life's work, he whispered. Finally. Useful for something beyond dusty genealogies. That evening, I returned to our empty house, the weight of Philip's illness still heavy, but a new resolve burning within me. Jeremy was right. We couldn't keep this quiet any longer. My conflict-avoidant nature was being systematically dismantled, brick by painful brick. I spent hours poring over Philip's archives, specifically the Miller family records, the village's water infrastructure plans, and old health reports. I found the faded, almost illegible notes Philip had been struggling to read the day he collapsed. They were about unexplained maladies in the Miller family line, mentioning unusual lung conditions. My brother had been on the verge of uncovering the truth himself. The next day, Jeremy and I met with Dr. Evans. He was initially skeptical, given her long history of dealing with city folk with grand ideas, but Jeremy's detailed geological and chemical analyses, combined with my brother's comprehensive historical records, slowly chipped away at her resistance. When we showed her the correlation between the documented arsenic levels and Philip's specific lung damage, her medical expertise, combined with her deep knowledge of the village's health history, led to a chilling realization. It explains so much, she murmured, poring over the data. The chronic coughs, the bad lungs that plagued some of the older families, we always attributed it to genetics or the dampness. My God. She agreed to support us to medically corroborate the potential health risks. Our first major hurdle was the village council. I took the lead, drawing on a well of unexpected courage. Standing before a room full of skeptical faces, neighbors I'd known my entire life felt like walking naked through the village square. But the image of Philip, his strength failing but his spirit clear, gave me strength. I spoke not just as Sharon Ivanov, the quiet sister, but as an Ivanov, a voice connected to generations of village history. Jeremy presented the scientific evidence, calmly and clearly. Dr. Evans, with her quiet authority, confirmed the medical implications. There was anger, disbelief, even outright hostility. Old man Henderson, his face red, accused Jeremy of trying to devalue their properties. Mrs. Gable fretted about the impact on the nascent tourism. But then, a few voices of reason began to emerge. A young mother whose child had suffered from unexplained chronic respiratory issues asked quiet, pointed questions. The schoolteacher who'd seen a pattern of fatigue in her students. The truth, however unpalatable, had a way of seeping in. Council agreed reluctantly to form a committee to investigate further, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. A month had passed since Philip's diagnosis. He was back home, frail but determined, confined mostly to his bed, the archive now silent, dark. The house, usually filled with the gentle rustle of his papers, felt eerily still. His chemotherapy continued, relentless and exhausting. Yet there was a new light in his eyes, a different kind of purpose. He was actively involved in the Water Safety Committee, as the council had formally named it, guiding me to obscure records, forgotten land deeds, and old maps that proved invaluable to Jeremy's ongoing investigation. He dictated letters to the council, his voice weak but his mind as sharp as ever, advocating for immediate action. Philip, the overachiever, was still striving, but now for the good of others, not just his own meticulous systems. He was letting go of his need for control, replaced by a profound desire to leave a meaningful legacy, a true protection for the village he loved. My own life had transformed beyond recognition. My quiet days were gone, replaced by meetings, phone calls, and endless research. I was no longer just assisting Philip. I was leading, organizing, speaking, advocating. I found myself in rooms I'd always avoided, engaging in conversations that would have sent me fleeing months ago. I learned to navigate bureaucracy, to stand my ground against skepticism, to find common cause with unlikely allies. Jeremy was always there, a steady partner, his expertise invaluable, but his presence also a constant, quiet support. We spent hours together, sifting through data, drafting proposals, planning our next moves. Our relationship, born of crisis, had deepened into a powerful, unspoken understanding. It was no longer just the charismatic newcomer. He was Jeremy, a man of integrity, deeply committed to a cause, flaws and all. He sometimes shared snippets of his own past, of his great-grandmother's struggles, revealing a vulnerability that humanized him further. He acknowledged that his initial secrecy had been a mistake, born of a desire for control that mirrored Philip's own. The turning point came when Jeremy managed to secure funding from a philanthropic environmental organization, a connection he'd cultivated for years. This allowed for comprehensive water testing across the village, confirming the arsenic contamination in various wells and springs, albeit at varying levels, with the Miller well being the epicenter. Irrefutable data, coupled with a growing number of villagers coming forward with similar chronic health complaints, finally broke through the council's resistance. A plan was put into motion. The Miller well would be permanently sealed, and the village's main water supply, sourced from a safer, uncontaminated aquifer high above the valley, would be upgraded and extended to all homes, a massive undertaking for a small community. It wouldn't be easy or cheap, but it was happening. Philip, though unable to leave his bed, followed every development, his eyes bright with a fierce, dying light. He had lived long enough to see his life's work, and his final, painful revelation bring about a necessary, life-saving change. The day they sealed the Miller well was a quiet, solemn affair. A small crowd gathered, a mixture of solemnity and a nascent sense of hope. I stood beside Jeremy, watching as concrete was poured, forever entombing the source of so much hidden suffering. Felt like a burial, not just of a physical well, but of a long-held secret, a collective ignorance. Later that evening, Philip slipped away peacefully in his sleep, his hand in mine. He left a note, written in his shaky hand. My work is done. My grief was profound, a raw, aching hole in my chest, but it was tinged with a quiet pride. He had died not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The village's transformation was slow, laborious, but steady. Construction crews worked on the new water lines, disrupting daily life but promising a healthier future. People were changing too, becoming more open, more willing to question, to demand transparency. The conflict-avoidant Sharon Ivanov was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more direct, someone who had found her voice not by avoiding conflict, but by embracing it for a greater good. My perception of Jeremy had evolved completely. He wasn't just a charming newcomer. He was a dedicated scientist, a compassionate ally, a man who had chosen to shoulder a burden he didn't have to. The wellness retreat plans were on hold, replaced by his work with the village, but his vision for a truly healthy community, both physically and spiritually, was clear. And my perception of Philip, my overachieving brother, had shifted from one of exasperated affection to profound respect. He had been so much more than just a keeper of dusty records. He had been a quiet protector, even in his final days, his meticulous nature ultimately serving a purpose far beyond his own understanding. The silence in the old Ivanov house was still vast, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a space waiting to be filled, not with the rustle of old papers, but with the hum of new purpose. I still tended my herb garden, still walked along the river, but now with a different rhythm, a different awareness. The mountain village, my sanctuary, had revealed its hidden dangers, forced me to confront truths I would have preferred to ignore. But in doing so, it had also revealed the strength of its community, the resilience of its people, and a strength within myself I never knew existed. The conflicts weren't entirely resolved. There would be long roads ahead, disputes about funding, inevitable human friction. But now I faced them head-on, no longer clutching a hammer, but holding a hand, ready to build. The quiet life I'd carefully constructed had been shattered, yes, but in its place, something more robust, more real, was slowly but surely taking shape.